to Life on Earth. Welcome to Life on Earth. Welcome to Life on Earth.
Well, hello, you good people, and welcome. Welcome to Life on Earth. I hope you are enjoying your life on Earth. I can tell you this, I'm enjoying my life on Earth even more than I would if it wasn't for Dr. Leonard Peikoff. You know, a couple weeks ago, going back to, what was it, May 24th, 2023, James Valiant and I presented an episode of Keeping It Real, in which we discussed Leonard Peikoff's book, Keeping It Real. Oh, by the way, for those of you listening to the podcast, I will be holding up books and videos and other things during this show. You don't need to see it all, but it's kind of cool if you can watch. So the YouTube version will be there too. Keeping It Real, May 24th. And we did an episode because we were celebrating our 50th episode, the impact of Dr. Peikoff on each of us with special guests. And we had the best special guests. It was very, very cool. Quent and Linda Cordero Quent was on for the majority of it. Linda checked in and said hi. Jonathan Honig checked in, and Kirk Barbero was on, and Nicholas Krusek was on, and James, of course, sharing the impact that Leonard Peikoff had on their lives. That was really cool, and it's nice to hear that tribute. But we went overtime. We're usually an hour. We went over an hour and a half, and I never got around to sharing my stuff, man. And it turns out the stuff that I have to offer you, you're going to love this. Some of this you're going to take away and say, I didn't know Leonard Peikoff did that. Or some of it you're going to say, I knew that Leonard Peikoff did that, but I didn't really fully appreciate just how awesome that was. I want to share with you hopefully a few surprises, lots of values, and a couple of links you're going to want to know about. So fortunately, I've got them all written down, top 10 plus one. Go through them real quick. What I want from you, what you thought this was like you were just going to receive and not have to do anything. What I want from you is I want to hear from you in the chat. What has Leonard Peikoff done for you? What are you grateful to Leonard Peikoff? And especially if he's had an impact on your life. Can you think about it? Can you sum it up? What has Leonard Peikoff really done for you lately? Or at all? So let me jump in. Oh, by the way, when you put in your comments, I will be reading all the comments today. I'm going to make sure I don't miss anything. But it is easier if you make them a super chat. Highlight them. Stand out. Why would you do that? Just for me? No, to support the Ayn Rand Center UK. You're probably already a member. If you're not already, AynRandCenter.co.uk. Link is at the top of the chat on YouTube as well. But if you put in a super chat, those dollars also support all the work that's being done here, including the extra hard work that was done this week, because we had a couple of hosts that were out. My partner, James Valiant, for example, was out sick yesterday. We couldn't do Keeping It Real. That's okay. If you missed last week's, you would catch that up instead. But I had the opportunity to be on with Nikos Sotirakopoulos for lunch today, Thursday Collective. It was a collective of two. A lot of people very busy this week. Your contributions will make it possible for us to drag those lazy, under the weather people in and do shows. Just kidding, but only a little. Thank you for those super chats as they come in. You can see why I'm going for a different look this afternoon. So you'll feel like you had three different hosts today. And how you feel is more important than the reality now, isn't it? Now, the number one on my list. Well, maybe not the number one. I'm going to call it number one. They're not necessarily in order, but this is good. The analytic-synthetic dichotomy. Now, there's an expression going around these days. They even abbreviate it. If you know, you know. IFK, YK. If you know Leonard Peikoff's The Analytic-Synthetic Dichotomy, I don't need to say any more. But this book, The Introduction to Objectivist Epistemology. Like, wait a minute, that's Ayn Rand book, right? Well, edited and with material by Harry Binswanger and Leonard Peikoff. This is the book that did it. This is the book that turned me into an objectivist. It grabbed me by the brain and dragged me into the movement. Well, metaphorically speaking. I brought this book with me in 1990, just a couple of years after discovering Ayn Rand, and then studying her materials, and then really thinking she had it all. But I brought this with me to conceptual conferences, 1990, my first ever objectivist conference, which I went to because I wanted to meet Leonard Peikoff before he passed away. Can you believe he's still alive and kicking and only retired in the 2010s? But, 1990, none of us knew, and I missed my opportunity to meet Ayn Rand in person. I'll get back to that in a minute. So yeah, brought this book with me and asked Leonard Peikoff to sign it. And he said, well, he had other materials of his that I had him sign. He said, this isn't one of my books. I don't sign other people's books. I said, I understand that, but your essay in here, which he did write, the analytic-synthetic dichotomy, this is the essay that turned me into an objectivist. This was the essay that answered the last unanswered question for me in philosophy that I guess if I understood Ayn Rand at a sort of deeper level than I did, maybe I would have got it, but no, this did it. And there is a reason why Ayn Rand included that essay in this book. It really answered the last of the tough philosophical questions. So sure enough, if you look, you do have Leonard Peikoff's signature there. He was just signing names at the time, so no message. More on that later. But yes, Leonard Peikoff, July 9th, 1990. #1 on the list, and most of this material is available online. If you don't have the book, though, you need it. And I'm going to jump right from that to #2. And the point I want to make by making that jump is #2 is available online. Most of the materials I'm going to talk about are available online. It was not like that when I was, I'll say your age. I don't know what age you are. Obviously, some of you are older than me, but when I was just getting into philosophy, getting into objectivism, late 1980s and then through the 1990s, man, this stuff was hard to find. #2, why should one act on principle? Why should one act on principle? This is the case for principled action. This is the case for moral principles and principles in general, propositions in general. It all extends out from the Introduction to Objectivist Epistemology, book #1. Why should one act on principle is presented by Leonard Peikoff, Ford Hall Forum, as he was writing OPAR. And if you read OPAR in the sections on acting on principle, some of the material is the same. Great lecture, great Ford Hall Forum presentation. This is to a general audience, mind you, and a great Q&A as well. And he makes the case for conscious, deliberate, principled action. It's the best case for conscious, deliberate, principled action that I know, and you can listen to it online. Now, you can search YouTube for it, but here's what I've got for you today. If you go to robertnasir.com, my name, robertnasir.com/show notes, you will find links to all of the stuff I'm going to talk about and a few things I might not even get to. So direct links there. You don't have to do any searching at all. robertnasir.com/show notes. I see my producers put it right in the chat. Yes, unsigned 32-bit individualist says the ominous parallels is but one example. Yes, that absolutely belongs on the list. That is actually in my plus list or +2 list. Get to that in a minute, but that is always a great suggestion. Thank you for that. Kindred Amy is in the chat. I know her. I think I know who that is. I might be meeting her at OCON, at least according to the thread she put online. Folks, if you're going to OCON, Amy Nasir has a thread asking who's going to be there. Make sure you check in if you want to meet her, meet us. So, yes, let's say Duchiorchi. Boy, I don't know how to pronounce that. But Duchiorchi says, sure, he has provided the right way to think, how to engage in proper polemics with false viewpoints in understanding objectivism. Folks, if you don't know understanding objectivism, it is one of a series of advanced, what I call advanced lectures. They were extended, they were longer. If you bought the cassette tapes back when we used cassette tapes for those things, there were many tapes, and they were expensive. That stuff was expensive, and now the Ayn Rand Institute makes so much of it just available for free. Heck, most of it's even on YouTube. Easy to access, very cool. And Maximus X says, when is OCON? OCON begins the 1st of July, I believe. I'm flying out on the 30th, and runs through the 6th. First week of July. Check the dates at Ayn Rand Institute's website. But yes, the first week of July. It's a tradition with OCON, which got shuffled around a little bit over COVID, but they're back on track to always have OCON over the Independence Day week, over the July 4th week. And they're doing it again. And it's a great time to be together with like minds celebrating Independence Day. Very, very cool. So yes, #1, the analytic synthetic dichotomy. #2, why should one act on principle? Along with why should one act on principle? Lecture that had a big impact on me as I was learning this stuff and starting to apply it to my life. I'm not one of those people who got into Ayn Rand or objectivism and like, oh yeah, I already knew all that. It kind of reinforced what I already knew. No, this stuff changed my life. And that #3 item, certainty and happiness, achieving success in thought and action. Another Ford Hall Forum lecture, which he originally gave at conceptual conferences. If you can track down the original recordings, I think that might be what's online. It has both the original longer presentation at the conference and the Q&A from both the conference and the Ford Hall Forum. Both of them are good. Very, very interesting. And the link to that is online. at robertnasir.com/show notes. I'm going to jump right to number 4 because you know it's coming. You know it's got to be there, which is this: Objectivism, the Philosophy of Ayn Rand. And the reason why this comes right after Certainty and Happiness and Why Should One Act on Principle is because those lectures, again, grew out of the work that Leonard Peikoff did putting this book together. This is the tome. This is the stuff. This is what I went to conceptual conferences for. He was actually giving lectures on the first 5 chapters. As he was writing them, we received them in manuscript form. The book wasn't published until a year and a half after that. It's actually when I met Jean Maroney for the first time, too, as she mentioned when I interviewed her a few weeks ago on this show. Objectivism, the philosophy, this is everything you need to know about objectivism and then some. And it's the systematization that puts the lie to the people who claim, well, Ayn Rand wasn't a proper philosopher. Her philosophy, it wasn't really a philosophy. No, it's all in here. The full justification for that claim is absolutely in here. Number 5. I'm going to put this in here. Oh, and Bonnie is in the chat and says, I got a glimpse of the genuine glamour Dr. Peikoff showed in his talk on operettas. It's something that doesn't exist anymore, except with a wink. But it was real when the Industrial Revolution was new. It's absolutely right. And, Ayn Rand sometimes talked about people who lived before World War I wouldn't believe the world we live in today. And the people who live in the world we believe in today, wouldn't believe what things were like before World War, before that level of cynicism, when that level of benevolence and optimism was out there. And yes, you get some of that when you hear Leonard Peikoff talking about operetta. He did that post-retirement and presented, and it's available on the Ayn Rand Center UK, the talks that Leonard taught. They weren't talks, they were events because he's retired, but he came on the channel and talked to us, let us know what he's doing in retirement. Thank you for that reminder there, Bonnie. But yes, Objectivism, the Philosophy of Ayn Rand, and then I'm going to jump right to Fact and Value. And what the essay, the analytic synthetic dichotomy, did for Platonic ideals and intrinsicism, the essay Fact and Value does for the supposed is-ought gap, as well as the question of open and closed objectivism. The is-ought gap, if Ayn Rand didn't demolish that enough herself, the essay Fact and Value, I know we think of it as part of the rift between David Kelly's organization and what Ayn Rand Institute does. Forget all that for a minute. This essay Fact and Value just demolishes the is-ought gap. Ayn Rand, of course, did that in the Objectivist Ethics when she explained that ethics grows out of that fundamental aspect of human life, that there is action required for our survival. But Fact and Value is a great essay in that regard. Highly recommended. That's why that made number 6 on my list. Let's see, Juan Lopez says, I really appreciated when Mrs. Peikoff shared his favorite quote in the Fountainhead. I like how he broke it down and explained because of Howard Roark character. I'm not sure I'm understanding what was written here. He broke it down and explained because of Howard Roark's character, he was immortal, he had integrity. Okay, not sure I understand exactly it might be a grammar that I'm not picking up there. But Rhett says, besides proper polemics, Peikoff taught me that polemics are only secondary. And the main point is to understand the world for yourself and use philosophy to enjoy your life. Well, Rhett, I couldn't agree more, which is obviously why I do a show called Life on Earth. I think that's exactly the point. And John says, Dr. Peikoff made philosophy exciting for me. The closing paragraph of Opar, thrilling tour de force. Leonard Peikoff is so good at ending his talks. I love the way, and it was also an Opar, but I don't think it was close of the book, where he says, for once, I think it's the objectivists who should say, love is the answer. But of course, he's talking about values, rational values. We're the ones who understand that more than the advocates of so-called love ever would. I'm going to jump to number 7 in my talk, but by all means, keep them coming. Would also love to see a super chat or two. Help us out, support the ARCUK. But number 7 was a series of, in my day, cassette tapes, but a lecture that Dr. Peikoff gave that was released under the title, Judging, Feeling, and Not Being Moralistic. Nowadays, in the link that is at robertnasir.com/show notes, you'll find it as How to Be Emotional in Making Choices, but Not Emotionalist. That's the first half of it. And the second half is How to Be Judgmental, but Not Improperly Condemnatory. So a little more explanation in the newer, longer title. And these are great examples. And Dr. Peikoff gives several examples in regard to how living by principles, it's not always easy, but it has to be done anyway. It's very easy to say, well, just don't judge. Judge not, lest ye be judged. And Leonard Peikoff doesn't just say, well, you've got to judge, you've got to know. He explains exactly what that looks like in reality, gives examples. Some of the examples he gave at the time were contentious, if you know the history of the philosophy, but still enormously valuable. Good. You don't have to agree with all of Dr. Peikoff's particulars to appreciate his method. It is brilliant. And like everything I'm talking about, the link is in the show notes. It is out there for you to consume. Number eight, I had to put Keeping It Real on the list. And not just because this is the book on which my series with James Valiant is based, giving us so far 50 opportunities to talk with each other and to talk with you about Leonard Peikoff's conclusions. This is the book not only that made that series possible, but Dr. Peikoff answers countless, just an incredible volume of real life questions, and that were asked by his listeners to his podcast, asked and answered over the course of years. I think it was 2006 to 2012. It's almost endless. Now, there are some questions that didn't make the book. Some of them are redundant, questions that have almost the same answer. Some questions that just weren't of general interest enough to put in a book. It's interesting, and the reason I mention that, the reason I want to hold up the book and talk about it, and another one of your takeaways, is that all of the podcast answers are still available on Leonard Peikoff's website. But the website is broken in a few places. The search function doesn't work right. It doesn't respond to web links with www at the beginning. So if you click a link that has that, you need to remove it manually. The website's a little bit foobar. But all the answers are still out there. In fact, there was on Objectivism Online a forum of questionable repute, but this was important. There was a thread on there. Somebody, and I hope somebody in the chat will know who it was and tell me, or send me an email or reach me on the socials, however you like. There was an index of every answer Leonard Peikoff gave on his podcast. And you could use that, since the website wasn't working right, to search for all of those answers, all of those questions. So I have downloaded a cached copy, a temporarily stored copy, and put that up on my website. If you go to robertnasir.com/objectivism, you can find the unofficial index to Leonard Peikoff's podcasts. That is going to be valuable to some of you who want to find his answer to a question when the search function doesn't work. Hopefully someday somebody will take over maintenance of Dr. Peikoff's website again and fix all of that. But in the meantime, there are ways to get that content. Again, Keeping It Real has, I don't know, the majority of it, but there's a bunch of stuff out there that's not in here. It is all still on Dr. Peikoff's website if you've got the means to find it. Either way, that makes number 8 of what I am grateful to Leonard Peikoff for. Again, this book, I know it seems like, well, it's ordinary stuff. It's everyday questions. How important could it be? It's real life. It's all the good stuff. Number nine, the sanction of the victims. Now, the sanction of the victims, when I first heard it, was only available to people like me as a Ford Hall Forum lecture, 1982. And this is the lecture that presents that same idea from Atlas Shrugged, that what's going on in the world today, the reason why we're losing so many battles, the reason why we're not living the lives we should, and why so many things are in decline, is by virtue of the sanction of the victims, in particular, businessmen, today's businessmen, who sanction the evils out there by supporting their enemies. She talked about many things, but in particular, that she said the one thing that you could do right away that would have a massive impact would be stop sending money to the colleges that spread the horrible anti-business ideas. People send money to their alumni funds in enormous amounts. Still happens to this day, hopefully less because she was willing to make that statement. She gave that speech, the sanction of the victims, to the Committee for Monetary Reform, if I remember right. It was a lecture she gave in New Orleans. She traveled down. And this was toward the end of her life. She was in very ill health. There's some great versions of the story you can find out there that presenters of this forum, just the gentleman leading it, loved her and gave her the best accommodations and did everything they could for her. It's a great story. But unfortunately, although it was a great lecture, and it was a lecture that would work for a general audience, so the plan was to present it at the Ford Hall Forum when the forum did their annual speech with Ayn Rand. And unfortunately, she didn't live that long. She didn't make it. So Leonard Peikoff opted to present her speech. And it's fun because at the beginning, he says, well, and it was difficult, it was hard, he was still choked up about it. But he said it was very difficult because he had to decide, do I present the speech exactly as she wrote it? Or do I modify it because it's now me, Leonard Peikoff, giving the speech? And he decided that the most proper thing to do, the most respectful thing to do, the right thing to do, was to present it exactly as written. And it's fun because in the speech, she compliments Leonard Peikoff, in particular with the release of, they were finally releasing the ominous parallels. And she says things like, this brilliant book by Leonard Peikoff. It's great fun to hear Leonard Peikoff kind of has to read that in his own voice. And he is not allowed to be modest, which is perfect. And because, as Unsigned 32-Bit says, the ominous parallels is a great piece of work and deserved every compliment that Ayn Rand gave it and that Leonard Peikoff delivered in his own voice, the sanction of the victims. Now, I've got a link to the Ford Hall Forum version, but you can, if you search for it, I'll see if I can find it and post it. You can find now, which was not available when I was young and finding out all these things, you can find the one that she delivered in person as well. Last speech she gave, the last big address that she made, and it's great to see that live as well. Number 10, and we're not quite near the end because I got a little more to say, but number 10 on my list of 1 through 10, and this is important for well, you if the shoe fits, this is going to be important for some of you and valuable for all of you. Number 10 is a lecture he gave called The Survival Value of Great, though philosophically false, art. This is a lecture on the value of art. And it's interesting because Leonard Peikoff has addressed this in various Q&As over the years. And people would, ask him for advice on literature, advice on, where can I find more books like Atlas Shrugged? And he made the point in this, you don't need to find another Atlas Shrugged because literature is not for learning objectivism or for furthering your political goals or for reinforcing your own political views. The purpose of art is broader than that. And art does not have to match your philosophy. It doesn't even have to match your sense of life. To do what art does, to provide you with that experience of entering interesting and in some cases magnificent and in some places terrifying, but interesting, compelling, and in the best art, knowable, understandable, dealable with worlds. Art it can inspire us to greatness. Now, as a secondary point, and as Ayn Rand said, art builds the model. Art is the irreplaceable medium for the communication of a moral ideal. But you don't have to agree with the morality of a given artwork for it to inspire you, for it to dazzle you, for it to remind you that more is possible in life than what you're living, for it to take you to places that are worth going for their own sake. So yes, number 10, absolutely. And again, this is one of those courses we used to buy the cassette tapes. Now you can read it for free online or listen to it for free online. The Survival Value of Great, though philosophically false, art by Leonard P. It's just magnificent. Just magnificent. Now, I have a bonus. Number 11. Won't be the last thing I say, but we're getting there. The lecture, My 30 Years with Ayn Rand, an Intellectual Memoir. I think Leonard Peikoff would have released this, would have done this tribute no matter what else happened, but especially as we got into the late 80s, early 90s, and some of the former associates of Ayn Rand were releasing they weren't even biographies, because they weren't biographies of themselves. They were just hit pieces. They were just So bad. Somebody asked me recently, did you see the movie, The Passion of Ayn Rand? I haven't seen the movie. Unfortunately, I read the book. And as I explained, the book left me with spiritual indigestion, with a bad aftertaste, because I could tell when the book was lying. It was, inherently self-contradictory. And I could tell what the method was, because Barbara Brandon would write in such a way as to say, like Ayn Rand never showed any signs whatsoever of being jealous about, some given thing. But we can only imagine that she must have felt, and then she would go on and on about what she must have felt. And that happened over and over. It got to where it was just silly of, Ayn Rand never showed any evidence that she was angry about X, but of course we can only imagine that she must have been really, really angry about X. It was, but the problem was, after reading the book, the quote unquote Passion of Ayn Rand, it left those after effects. And for some time after that, remember, I'm young, I'm just learning who this person is, I would run into stories about Ayn Rand that would leverage this information, and I would have to remind myself, oh yeah, that wasn't true. That was just something Barbara Brandon said. Oh yeah, Ayn Rand wasn't like that. That was just what her Barbara Brandon's ex-husband said. So I trust this book much more, The Passion of Ayn Rand's Critics by James Valiant. So I would go there. Incidentally, and entirely apart from the reason why I bring this one up, is Leonard Peikoff was not directly involved with this book at all, but the Ayn Rand Institute did make Ayn Rand's papers available to James Valiant with the permission of Leonard Peikoff, so that he could put this book together. And they didn't tell him what to write. They didn't steer him in any way whatsoever. He's talked about that before. You can get that information from him. But it made it possible for him to write the book that he did. And the other amazing thing, why this is a must-read book, is because half of the book is actually just Ayn Rand's journals. Now, there's a great book, The Journals of Ayn Rand, out there, and you absolutely should own it. But it didn't include the personal stuff about her personal life, her private life. This book does. And it's just to set the record straight. What was Ayn Rand writing for her own eyes, not for anybody else, not to try to convince anybody else of anything? And, some people have answered, well, sometimes we lie to ourselves. No, read those journals. You decide for yourself. That claim is not credible once you read Ayn Rand's own words in her own journals. So this is highly recommended. But my gratitude is to Leonard Peikoff for making that possible, both by creating the Institute, but also allowing that sharing of those materials. So yeah, my 30 years with Ayn Rand, intellectual memoir. He calls it an intellectual memoir because he doesn't get too much into the personal, kind of like the journals don't get as much into the personal. And yet, by the end, it's there's so much value expressed. Tears in my eyes at the end, choked up. So yeah, I want a little bit in my life of what Leonard Peikoff experienced knowing Ayn Rand. So good. So real quick, runners up. As I mentioned, there are some long form lectures that Leonard Peikoff gave, and even whole courses that were very expensive. We would joke about, a briefcase or a suitcase full of cassette tapes in order to, spend $100 to rent them, or $2,000 to own them. Some of these you couldn't own. You could only rent them, back in the day. But nowadays, not only can you buy most of this stuff, most of it you can get for free online. One of them, just as one example, one of our folks in the chat already mentioned Understanding Objectivism. Leonard Peikoff did a course called The History of Philosophy. And he did it in two parts. He did ancient Greece up to Thales, I believe. And then, no, Thales to, no, it was to, now I don't remember. Somebody will tell me in the chat. And then modern philosophy. It's I don't even remember how long it was, how many lectures were involved. And now it's all available for free. It's all good. And in fact, let's talk about the Ayn Rand Center UK, which you should be supporting with a super chat right about now, but also should join as a member. And if you're a member, you have access to the Sunday morning study groups with James Valiant, who has done most of the history of philosophy, is going through it now. And many of these other longer courses, like Understanding Objectivism and Objectivism Through Induction. There are 2 years of study groups, and this is not hardcore study. It's good, deep, rich study, but it's also fun. It's pleasant. It's enjoyable. It's a little like listening to Dr. Peikoff's lectures. So yes, if you are a member of the Ayn Rand Center UK, and there are several different levels at which you become a member, a few extra perks as you work your way up. You've heard about some of that recently. Then you will have access to that information. But yes, The History of Philosophy by Leonard Peikoff, for those of you like me, who only got through Philosophy 102 in college, and back at U of M, Philosophy 102 wasn't that good. The History of Philosophy, highly recommended. The lecture, The American School, Why Johnny Can't Think. Now, if you've read the Comprachicos by Ayn Rand, you know what things were like in the 1960s, what direction they were going. If you want to hear the update from the 1980s, Leonard Peikoff offered that. He also provided a lecture called A Rational Curriculum in order to tell you, well, here's the fix to that. He did a lecture. He presented a lecture at the Ford Hall Forum called Religion versus America. And I wish more people would listen to that one right about now. Why going backwards is not the answer. That's not the form in which he presented it, but it's exactly the answer I get out of it watching it now. Going backwards is not the answer. There are folks who say, well, there's no choice. Yaron Brook just talked about this. There's a gentleman who's a member of what are called the European conservatives. And he's an agnostic. He's not a religious guy, but he says, you know, the only way out of the mess we're in, the only way to fight the woke, the only way to fight cancel culture, the only way to fight DEI, we got to get in bed with the Christians. It's the only way. Robert Stadler, what can you do when you have to deal with people? You just got to fool them so you can get what you want out of it. I don't even know how people can think that way other than they've just given up. But anybody who would listen to Religion versus America by Leonard Peikoff would say, whatever the solution is, this ain't it. So many of these courses, writing a mini course, poems I like and why. And of course, as was mentioned earlier, Viennese operetta, My Virtual Reality. This was his 2001 session. Link to that is also at robertnasir.com/show notes. Now you can go to Dr. Peikoff's website. As I say, some of the functions there are not working right, but the courses and lectures list is available. His final podcast, the final episode of his podcast is available. Great quotes from Leonard Peikoff. There is, I don't know. I'm going to show you these just to make you jealous. But if you can find a copy of Leonard Peikoff in his own words, James Valiant and I basically had a conversation that talked about a lot of this, but to actually see Leonard Peikoff, both at conferences and in his private life, that was great. Great fun there. Even harder to find is this one, Leonard Peikoff at West Point. If you can find that one, that's good stuff as well. I suspect eventually all of this will be digitized and properly released online. But thank you for sharing some of your own. It will it is very gratifying to have people check in and let me know. We did that episode, and at the time, some of you all shared some of yours as well. But it's as Leonard Peikoff is not a young man anymore. It's been great to occasionally he'll share, and you get to see what he's been up to and what he's interested in. And when he shares from his home, you can tell he's got a beautiful home, and he's got that benevolence. He's obviously lived these ideas and has done it very well. But sometimes he's humble. Sometimes he says, well, I'm not Ayn Rand. I didn't originate this philosophy. I did my best at bringing Ayn Rand to people. But when I listen to Understanding Objectivism Through Induction, some of these longer courses, History of Philosophy, and then consider what it took to write Objectivism, the Philosophy of Ayn Rand. This was, if you've heard the 1976 lectures, you know what he was sharing back then. And then to read this, where much of the same information, but organized just in a bulletproof, rational, logical fashion. This was not just Leonard Peikoff being a great student of Ayn Rand. This is Leonard Peikoff as a philosopher in his own right. And, there have been some episodes in Objectivism with regard to different organizations. There have been people critical of the way Leonard Peikoff has handled some of that. it's bizarre to me, because if I have any criticisms of Leonard Peikoff, if I had any criticisms about anything that he's ever said or written, it would be absurd to even bring them up. They pale in comparison to what this man has produced and the inspiration that he's provided. I'll be doing a show soon about why The Fountainhead is your favorite novel. Okay, a bit of a tweak. It's my favorite novel. It probably is your favorite novel. If it's not, I'll try to make that case. But really, just why The Fountainhead is so great. And I always say I want to be Howard Rourke when I grow up. I don't literally want to be Howard Rourke. I don't want to dye my hair orange. I don't want to be missing buttons on my shirt. I don't even want to be with Dominique Franken. I want to be with Dagny Taggart. But I want to have that richness of life and that spirit, that focus on the positive, that, I see evil, I'll fight it when I have to, but otherwise I don't think of it. In some ways, Leonard Peikoff gives us that too. I want to live like Leonard Peikoff. I want to figure out what I want, and then I want to make it happen. And I want to produce in the kind of quality and quantity that he has. I'm not going to match Leonard Peikoff, but he gives us that inspiration. This is a guy, this is a life that was an end in itself. This was a life worth living, and he's still living it. I don't mean to make it sound like a postmortem. Hopefully Leonard Peikoff's going to be around for a long, long time still to come. And I'm sure that he is having the time of his life. I want to give a huge shout out to Dale. Dale, thank you for being in. If I remember right from online, you're not going to be at OCON, and I'm kind of bummed about that. So I'm glad to see you in the chat. And having heard you sing at the last OCON talent show, I know you've got the spirit. So thank you very much. Thank you for your support. Very, very cool. Again, we did a show, and if you missed it, go back and watch it. Keeping It Real, number 50, our tribute to Leonard Peikoff. Glad to hear everybody talk. I intentionally kept my mouth shut, and when we ran out of time, I thought, well, I've got to present my top 10. If you want to see that top 10, if you want to click those links, all that free stuff, for which I've got suitcases of cassette tapes in my storeroom, and it costs me thousands of dollars, and you get to listen to for free, which I am not jealous of, but totally happy for you. robertnasir.com/show notes. You'll find more information, including that index at robertnasir.com/objectivism, all sorts of quirky stuff on that website. So thank you. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for letting me go on about Leonard Peikoff. Thank you for sharing your information. Bonnie in the chat says, I like that Dr. P is taking great care of himself. And she wraps it up. And couldn't ask for a better way to wrap it up. She says, a philosophy for living on earth. Thank you for joining me.